Bourbon, the spirit of Kentucky. Hi, I'm Jennifer Garrett. I'm a senior at the University of Kentucky. The topic I would like to talk to you about today in this presentation is Kentucky's bourbon. Kentucky-born author Jessie Stewart once wrote, "If these United States can be called a body, then Kentucky can be called its heart." And really, bourbon could be considered its lifeblood. 95% of all bourbon originates from Kentucky. The deeply rooted bourbon industry dramatically impacts the economy of Kentucky, and in turn, the people of Kentucky positively influence the success of the bourbon industry. Starting with the history of how bourbon came to be a world-renowned product that originated in Kentucky, the ties to the state are evident. Then, looking deeper into the size and scope of the bourbon industry, the distilleries and the products create opportunities for the betterment of the state and its people. The people of Kentucky also have made bourbon into a well-known product with their hard work and innovation. As a result, people flock from far and wide to get a uniquely Kentucky experience by partaking in bourbon-related activities and events. The jobs, tourism, and taxes all allow Kentucky to thrive because of the big business of bourbon. The objectives for this presentation are: first, discover bourbon's rich history in Kentucky. Then, we will establish what makes a bourbon. Next, we will explain how Kentucky taxes the bourbon and consider how bourbon impacts Kentucky. We will evaluate the importance of Kentucky's people on the bourbon business and finally conclude that Kentucky's bourbon industry improves the economy and the state, and we will consider how Kentucky's residents influence its success. By the end of this presentation, it will be evident that bourbon fuels the state's economy, and the people of Kentucky are the key factors in what makes the bourbon industry succeed and thrive. Why Kentucky? Imagine a place where pristine limestone waters flow through lush green rolling hills and hollers, a perfect mix of sunshine and rain, warm and cold, a place where the soil is rich and fertile and there are plentiful trees, a place where all these elements come together to create the perfect environment to make bourbon. Bourbon was born on the frontier of Kentucky. Kentucky's bourbon history begins in the 1700s when settlers from the 13 colonies crossed the Appalachian Mountains and moved to the area that we now know as Kentucky. They found that this region was perfect for growing corn. In the 1780s, a new style of corn-based whiskey was being distilled here. In 1792, Kentucky joins the United States as the 15th state. In 1807, French settlers along the Mississippi River brought the custom of storing spirits in charred casks. They used this technique to carry their liquor down the long voyage of the Mississippi River to New Orleans. In 1821, the term bourbon, was first used in a news ad referring to the whiskey that came from this region. What makes it a bourbon? In 1964, Congress passed a resolution that defined bourbon and distinguished it from other spirits. Bourbon falls under the broad category of whiskeys. All bourbon is a whiskey, but only some whiskeys are considered bourbons. To be a bourbon, it must be made in the USA. It could be made in any state of the United States, but 95% of all bourbon comes from Kentucky. It must be made from at least 51% corn. Bourbon mash bills are generally a mixture of corn, malted barley, maybe some wheat or rye. Different mash bill configurations can create unique products. If there's high wheat, it makes a smoother bourbon, and if there's high rye, it creates a spicier effect. It must be distilled at less than 160 proof and entered into the barrels at no more than 125 proof. Bourbon must be aged at least 2 years in charred American oak barrels. The charring of the barrel caramelizes the oak, which imparts the amber color and different flavors. It acts as kind of a charcoal filter as the liquid is drawn into and released out of the barrel staves during Kentucky's temperature swings. There can be no additives such as flavoring or colors added to the bourbon. It's just the mash bill and water. All the flavor comes from the barrel and aging process. But if you've ever had a good bourbon, who needs additives? And the finished product must be bottled at least 80 proof. A step further in bourbon standards is being bottled in bond. The Bottled in Bond Act required companies to adhere to a strict standard of distillation practices. The Bottled and Bond Act was the first real consumer protection law even before the Food and Drug Administration. As a result, consumers were able to look for whiskey that donned the Bottled and Bond label to be confident in the quality and purity of the whiskey they drank. In addition, it was a significant step for companies to be held accountable for the products they produced and the safety of those who used them. To be labeled Bottled and Bond, the product must be of a single distillation season by a single distiller at a single distillery. It must be stored and bottled in a bonded warehouse under the U.S. government supervision for no less than 4 years. Bottled and Bond does not allow the removal or addition of material to alter the substance in any way from the original product, except for using water to get it to the proof needed. It needs to be bottled at 100 proof, and it has to have a Bottled and Bond label over the cork. The label must include the name, location, and quantity of spirits in the bottle. Now that we know the standards of bourbon, let's explore how it's made. Making bourbon requires artistic skill paired with some science. This is a very simplified process of making bourbon, but it'll give you a little background. First, you need to select your grain and determine your mash bill or the configurations of grains used. Remember, bourbon must be at least 51% corn. Water needs to be added to the crushed grains so that the starches in the grains can be cooked and converted to sugars. We need those sugars to produce some ethanol. Limestone filtered water like that in Kentucky is key because it's low in iron and high in sweet tasting calcium and magnesium. Next is cooking to get the grain starches to convert to sugars. And then yeast is added, and each distillery has its own unique yeast strain. Some of them even survive in the Prohibition era, and some of them are patent protected because it's proprietary to their finished product, kind of top secret. Yeast is added to convert the sugars to ethanol. The liquid is then distilled in column stills, resulting in a neutral, clear product called White Dog. The White Dog is then placed into new charred white oak barrels and stored into a rickhouse or a warehouse for at least 2 years. Rotation of the barrels into different areas of the warehouse is done because of temperature variations. Some of the very best bourbon distillers have found that their rickhouses have sweet spots that are best for aging. Kentucky's hot and cold weather draws the liquid into and out of the charred barrel staves during the aging process. This process gives us the color and flavor of bourbon. Some of that liquid is evaporated, somewhere between 4 to 10% a year. It's called angel share. Most bourbons are aged for 2 to 4 years. A lot of them are aged for more. I think the sweet spot's about 7 to 8 years, but very expensive bourbons can be aged for more than 20. Now we'll look at how bourbon impacts Kentucky. It impacts Kentucky in many different ways, from the tax revenue collected on income, distilleries, tourism, and even the bottles and barrels of bourbon. Also in job creation, the bourbon industry employs over 20,000 people. The tourism industry brings people from all over Kentucky to be a part of this very unique bourbon culture and its experiences. According to the Kentucky Distillers Association, nearly 60% of every bottle goes into taxes or fees. Kentucky is the only state that taxes its aging liquors. The taxes that bourbon contributes are $8.6 billion in economic output to the state as of 2020, which creates an enormous impact to the state's budget. The taxes on Kentucky's bourbon are somewhat complex. Some of them attach to bourbon even before consumers purchase it. For example, there's a tax called ad valorem, which taxes the rising value of a barrel of whiskey every year it ages. 1 nickel is paid for every $100 of the bourbon's assessed value. Now, this doesn't seem like a lot, but in 2017, this tax added $2.6 billion to the state's coffers. And by 2020, that number increased to $3.4 billion in taxes on the aging liquor. This increase in taxes shows us exactly how much of an increase there is in the amount of bourbon that's aging in Kentucky. Exactly how much bourbon is in Kentucky? According to the Distillery Trail website, there were 42 distilleries in 2020, and those numbers are growing because of all the new craft distilleries springing up. There's 9.8 million barrels aging, and that averages out to be about 2 barrels of aging bourbon for each Kentucky resident. The people of Kentucky have also made bourbon into a well-known product with their hard work and their innovation. As a result, people flock from far and wide to get a uniquely Kentucky experience partaking in bourbon-related events and activities. As of 2016, Loosemore from the Courier-Journal reported that there were more than 4,000 people employed at distilleries and around 17,000 directly and indirectly employed in bourbon-related jobs in Kentucky. The payroll for these jobs is over $1 billion per year. The directly related jobs in bourbon are in production and distilling, sales and marketing, the distillery's tastings and tours, and maintenance of the distillery grounds and aging facilities. Some of these jobs are very dangerous, strenuous, and they create demanding work environments with conditions that take a toll on their workers. Some of the indirectly related jobs are in farming to raise the grains to make bourbon and water processing. Driving trucks to haul crops, logs, and finished bourbon is also a big employer. Loggers cut down trees for the barrel coopers to make bourbon barrels, and there's an increasing demand for craftspeople to make bourbon arts and furniture since they only use the barrels once. There are jobs selling used barrels to other alcohol producers. Also, the Vendome Company in Louisville is world-renowned for making copper stills and spirits. The liquor store employees and even bankers are indirectly impacted by this industry. There are also tourism-related jobs at hotels, restaurants, giving tours, and gift shops that are tied to the bourbon industry. While tasting and tours are part of the allure, it's not all about drinking. Historic sites, scientific production, beautiful scenery, and welcoming people all draw tourists in to see this bourbon industry. More than 1.7 million bourbon tours across the state's distillers were given in 2020. Kentucky's bourbon companies have invested significant amounts of revenue into new or updated visitor centers to highlight their history and allow guests to immerse themselves in the sights and smells of bourbon making. As a result, the Bourbon Trail visitors spend anywhere between $400 to $1,200 per visit. In addition, more than 70% of the visitors come from outside the state. To assist these visitors in planning their trips, there's a new Bourbon Trail Passport and Guide, a guide to Kentucky's distilleries, complete with itineraries and local highlights. The people of Kentucky have done an excellent job in attracting people to visit this uniquely Kentucky experience. In conclusion, we can see that bourbon's rich history was born in Kentucky. Bourbon is a product that is unique and protected by many laws and standards. Kentucky taxes the bourbon heavily, and this affects Kentucky in significant revenue from all the taxes collected. The people of Kentucky positively impact the bourbon business with their innovation and hard work. The research provided in this presentation shows that Kentucky's bourbon industry improves the economy of the state, and it also shows how Kentucky residents influence its success. The $8.6 billion bourbon industry is unique to Kentucky. It provides more than 20,000 jobs within the state. $325 million are collected annually in tax revenue. Bourbon and the people of Kentucky help each other to succeed and to thrive. Thank you for your time. Now, get out and enjoy Kentucky's rich bourbon culture.